Ladies and gentlemen, hello, if I could have your attention, please. Thank you so much for coming to the first, hopefully of many, London Symposium. I know that you're not, are you sure what you don't know what to expect, do you? Really, I've gone around and hopefully I've met all of you just now. My name is Ria. I'll be your hostess for the evening. We're just coming around and topping up the champagne glasses. So if you'd like champagne for this first section, just please put your hand up and we'll bring you a glass if you don't have one already. Perfect. We take the music out. Thank you. Okay. Hello, my name is Ria. First of all, before we begin, if we could please give a quick round of applause and a big thank you to David Lonsdale and everyone here at the Seckford for hosting us. It really is amazingly generous of their time and their space for us to be here, and we're quite excited to have that. Well, it's been very fast in the making, this idea, and so you are our first, as you know, invited guest list to come to this, and we're hoping, we know it's going to be a wonderful success because we know everyone that's in the room and we know you're wonderful people. Yes? Yes. The reason and the topic for today, and I will allow the panelists to expand on that further, and our chair for this evening, of course, is that we've just had a rather momentous event happen on Friday in British history, and we feel it's time to finally move on and heal. And that's what we'd like to do tonight, is to move on and heal through the medium of intellectual and invigorating conversation. So that is the plan. And to that end, this is why, again, we are so thankful to the Seckford for being so generous in providing some of the social lubrication that will help us with that in the form of well, bit of, what do you call it? Champagne. Sparkly goodness. Frothy. Okay, you're on a different drink to the rest of us, sir. All right, wonderful. Frothy goodness. Okay, shaken, not stirred, I see. Without further ado, though, I would like to welcome to the stage, so if you could applaud them all until they reach their stools, our panel for this evening. The way that the evening will run is that we are going to have our panelists speak for the first half. We'll have a quick interval in the middle for us all to refresh ourselves and actually hopefully start the conversation at that point amongst ourselves, and then we will come back into the room for a second half of, well, let's call it a Q&A, but hopefully it's just more of a structured conversation between ourselves. As you can see, it's all being recorded. Please try not to speak until I come to you with the microphone in the second half, but I'll explain that again. Everybody here will be mic'd up, and I think they're ready. I'm sorry, before we start, could we just check on that slight reverb that I'm getting? And Tim, are you getting that as well? Apologies, a little bit of a tech question. Okay. Wonderful, thank you for that. All right, without further ado, if you could please put your hands together and welcome to the stage our panelists today. They are our chair, Emma Whelan, and our panelists, Claire Fox, Faiza, Shaheen, and Sebastian Payne.
Can't get up.
Right.
Very high up.
I feel like I'm on the X Factor or something. Hi, everyone.
I need a table.
Thank you very much, Ria, for that lovely introduction. And yes, so I'm going to be the chair for this first half of the discussion. A subject which I've been having numerous debates about, I'm sure all of you have, because obviously 2020, we're in a new decade, we're in with a new party, it's a new post-Brexit Britain, there's lots of new things going on, and so necessarily that means there's lots of questions about what this new political landscape needs, what kind of questions we need to ask, and what kind of answers we can come up with and solutions for the problems or the challenges that have been brought up over the last few months and years. And thankfully, I've got a fantastic panel to help us figure that out. The way it's going to work is we're going to have 5-minute introductory speeches, and then the panel are going to not get straight into consensus building, but have a bit of a discussion and figure out where the differences lie, maybe where the similarities lie, and then we're going to, after the break, take it over to you guys, as Ria said. So a little bit about me. My name's Ella Whelan. I'm a journalist, author of a book called What Women Want. I was the co-convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival last year in 2019. do a lot of stuff in relation to British politics, but also issues like feminism and free speech. And now to introduce someone's got the giggles in the front. Are you okay? You're all right. Now to introduce my panel. First of all, I've got Sebastian Payne. Seb is a Whitehall correspondent for the Financial Times, and in his role, he writes on British politics and policy, specialising in the Conservative Party, Brexit, and foreign policy. And I suppose his remit's being opened up now that the B word is...
Yeah, no longer the B word. It doesn't exist.
No longer the B word is open. And writes a regular column for the opinion pages about politics outside of Westminster. He's always on the television, always someone who's come for a voice on what's going on with Westminster, but also broader political trends. So can you please welcome Sebastian and me? Next up, I have Dr. Faiza Shaheen, who is the director for the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, or CLASS, as you might know it as. Prior to this, she was the head of inequality and sustainable development at Save the Children UK, and where she led on the development of a new global campaign on inequalities and child outcomes. But more recently, she ran as a Labour MP in Chingford and Woodford Green, and so has direct experience with what the 2019 election took, what happened, the kind of questions that came out of that. So please can you welcome Faiza with me. And then we have Claire Fox, who is the director of the Academy of Ideas, author of I Still Find That Offensive, massive commentator on issues of free speech, does a lot of what her festival, the Battle of Ideas Festival, has been running for 15 years now. And more recently, and more temporarily, was a Brexit Party MEP, now, I suppose, officially unemployed from that role and enjoying it, but certainly as well has that kind of experience in what, from a different side to Faiza, of what the election, the kind of questions that came up from voters, and especially with her experience of being Brexit MEP for the North West and that kind of voice that was happening in the election. So please can we welcome Claire. Right, I'm nothing but a stickler for time, so the panellists have 5 minutes to give their opening provocations, speeches, or maybe they'll just use it to ask a lot of questions, and then after that we'll get stuck into the debate. So without further ado, Seb.
Thank you very much. Well, it's been less than a week since we've left the EU, and it's amazing how everything feels very different and absolutely not different in any way whatsoever. That I spend all my time working in Westminster, but I go around the country. I haven't been around the country since we've left the EU, so I can't really say how that feels. But when we look to the year ahead and a decade ahead, I have to say I kind of feel quite happy and quite optimistic about what might be happening here, because first of all, that divide that has split everything, it's split families, friends, society, parties, the whole lot over Brexit is now come to an end. And that happened on December the 12th. And there are some of us, it might be quite hard to believe, who are quite ambivalent about the whole Brexit thing, who didn't feel strongly about one side or the other. And people like me who feel like that are delighted the whole thing is over, because to some extent it feels like we can get back to business as usual. Now, some people disagree that we can ever go back to business as usual after that, but I feel that is actually what's happening, that issue has now been resolved. And when we called that referendum, that was the whole point of it, right? Was to say to the country, this issue needs to be decided one way or another. And I think in 3 elections, the British public voted they wanted to leave the EU. That's now happened. I still can't believe it. It's kind of weird thing it actually happened. But there we are. It happened. And I'm just quite happy as someone who adores domestic policy, talking about economics, that's something we're actually going back to. I'm probably the only person who thinks that. But there's so much to be fixed in our society. And I know one of the things that Claire's talked about a lot, and she will talk about later, is the Brexit vote was not about the EU. It was not about our relationship with Europe. It was about everything here and people not being happy in this country about the political settlement, the economic settlement, and how the country was feeling. And when the Conservatives won that decisive general election victory at the end of last year, it was on a moment of change. People wanted to change. They didn't quite like Jeremy Corbyn's feeling of that change, but they liked the way Boris Johnson presented. And everything that I see and hear from this government suggests they are going to deliver on that change. There's going to be a lot of things they're going to do that are very unconservative. We've already seen that Flybe, an airline that was unprofitable and potentially uncompetitive, was propped up. So Boris Johnson has transformed into Ted Heath already, without the piano playing. And I think there's going to be a lot more of that. And this whole left-right divide, that's going to be smushed all over the place over the next decade as well. I think that there's this great realignment. There's a lot of very exciting things that can happen. I think when we come to the next election in 5 years' time, I kind of guess it'll be quite hard for the Labour Party to bounce back from that, because Boris Johnson will do quite a lot of bold things. He's going to build a lot of stuff. There's £100 billion in the Conservative manifesto to build hospitals, roads, railways, airports, you name it. And if there's one thing we know the Prime Minister loves, is big projects that have his name all over them. One of the many ways he's like Donald Trump. So he will certainly do that. So I would say at this moment of change, I feel quite happy and optimistic. I think things are actually going to change. And I grew up in the northeast of England. I was a rare person in the northeast who wasn't a Labour Party supporter when I grew up. And now, as I think they did on Dead Ringers the other day, it's very unusual in the northeast to be a Labour Party supporter. And it's quite heartening to see that this part of the world is getting listened to for the first time and might actually get some of the things it's needed for decades. So bring on the 20s.
Thank you, Zach. Faiza.
Yeah, I mean, I find it a very problematic framing to act like Brexit is done. I mean, obviously it's not done. We're in the next phase of Brexit. We were at the end of the beginning, and now we are in this phase in which we're going to be, doing so much in terms of negotiating trade deals. And, we have to think that those trade deals, how they are shaped, and they will include all kinds of things from employment rights to what we do on immigration. I mean, it will colour everything going forward. So Brexit isn't done, and it will shape and colour everything for the next few years, and it will shape this country. And I think also, why I find that kind of Brexit is done thing so annoying is because in a way, Brexit actually did expose a lot of the underlying issues. One of the arguments that I would have with people that were wanting a second referendum and wanting to remain ultimately is that, look, this isn't just about the EU, that there was a lot of dissatisfaction in this country, and that's why the Brexit vote happened in the first place. And so Brexit exposed that regional inequality, the lack of voice, that people felt that things were happening in Westminster, very far away. And Brexit also, in the last few years of the kind of upheaval that has come after that, has exposed and intensified problems, real divisions that have been stirred up, not just on Remain leave, but things like the white working class versus immigrants, the racism, the kind of racist attack. I mean, I genuinely, before the Brexit vote, I just had never had any racist comments on Twitter, and it certainly did, and that's, on the day on Friday, one of my staff members was telling me today about she just saw two racist incidents on the same day. So to act as if, some problems haven't been stirred up by this upheaval and the way in which this conversation has been badly handled in the last few years, it's just not true that Brexit is over. Brexit has given us a new wave of issues and exposed a number of underlying issues as well. And I was just thinking earlier about this and thinking about what I would have spoken about maybe 10 years ago. And those things are all still relevant as well. So my PhD looked at trends in inequality, and at that time, we were told that inequality didn't matter, but, we've seen over the years that people are starting to recognise that the gap between the rich and the poor, whether you measure it by wealth, whether you measure it by income, whether you measure it by power and voice, whether you measure it by representation and who ends up as our judges and as our politicians, etc., is really important. And so I think in the 2020s, looking forward, that issue of inequality, and it's not unrelated to Brexit as well, we have to go back to, and we have to consider seriously how we're going to address that. And it'll be interesting to see what the Conservatives think on that as well, because of course they have taken these northern seats, and they do have to address regional inequality. And by the way, you say about the kind of 100 billion or whatever, that's nowhere near enough to address the underlying issues of inequality in this country, which have been getting worse over the last 40 years. Secondly, I still do talk a lot about automation and the way in which that is changing the labour market, and in particular where that leaves a lot of non-graduates in terms of getting work and being thrown out of work and being able to get skilled and come back into and find other jobs. So these are all the problems that were there that I was working on in 2010 that we haven't solved. Aging society, the demographic change we're seeing in this country, the social care crisis is insane, and the way in which we treat social care workers as well. Of course, let's not forget that. And of course, climate. I was working on it in 2010 and still here in 2020, we just haven't done enough to get on top of it. Nowhere near enough. And again, this is big scale funding that we would need to do. In the last 10 years, what I would add to those 4 big trends and underlying long-term challenges is the cuts and the impacts of the cuts. If I look at local Facebook pages, the stabbings, the issues of fear of crime, we've done society on the cheap for 10 years. And it shows, it really does show. So this is another issue we're going to have to address. And it won't just be solved by more police officers on the street. There's something much, much deeper that's happened to scar and undermine public services in this country, whether you look at education, whether you look at school exclusions, whether you look at, we have a record number of children going into care. So, in the last 10 years, we've got the whole austerity issue that has added on top of those underlying trends that we have to deal with it, climate or automation. And finally, in the last 4 years, and it does sound just said a whole bunch of problems, and we can talk a bit about solutions. But on top of that now, one of the things that really concerns me in this election, but even before that, was how democracy is being undermined by things like, the lies on Facebook, 88% of Conservative ads found to be lies. There's nothing that happens as a consequence. What's happened? And I saw it locally as well. It's you can just make things up, and the ways in which new media are playing into that. And finally, and I want to make this point again, because as one of the few people of colour in the room, I was at a meeting on Sunday, and the amount of people of colour that stood up and said, "I'm scared. I'm worried about these trends. I'm seeing this. This happened to me on the bus. This happened." Again, it's not that racism went away, but the discussions that we have that are so toxic are bringing up ways in which people feel that they're much more emboldened. So look, there's a number of long-term issues, newer issues from the last 10 years and even newer issues in the last few years that we're going to have to deal with in the 2020s. We've got to get real about that.
Okay, thank you, Faiza. Claire.
So I think I agree, Faiza. Certainly I find it irritating, that phrase, Brexit being done. And I particularly don't like that idea, now that Brexit's done, we can get on with the really important issues, because that implies that Brexit was some annoying little thing that you had to get out of the way, and now we can go on to really big issues. Whereas for me, Brexit is the start of what can be a way of addressing really big issues, but it's not done, it's not over, but I, of course, see it as rather exciting. And I don't want to kind of dismiss it as some kind of technocratic hurdle that we had to get over. For me, the Brexit mandate represents the restoration of a sense of agency amongst voters. And it's indicated to people that change can happen, and people now feel as though they've got power in their hands. And I think that gives possibility. Simple as that. No guarantees, but possibility. To remind people that a year ago, most people who voted Leave, like myself, thought it was over, thought we'd lost, given up. Basically, we'd been thwarted no matter what we did, and we basically had a sense of despair. And it translated into people feeling that their vote had been trashed, that they themselves didn't matter, that having been mobilised in great numbers to vote in the referendum, that they were now going to be sidelined. And there was a real sense of visceral disillusion. And also, worse than that, they weren't just being ignored, but they were being slandered and traduced for just simply voting in a referendum. But they were being told that they were stupid or backwards or xenophobic or whatever, all of the stuff. So there was a bitter sense of feeling marginalised. And I think that it's very positive that the voters, very ruthlessly, one way or another, used the Brexit Party as a vehicle to restate that they wanted to leave the European Union. So they did that in the European elections. And then in the last general election, used the Conservative Party as a vehicle to reassert once again that their votes mattered. I do not, under any circumstance, believe that everyone's become Conservative overnight. This is a way of saying something else, and that's interesting. We can talk about what it might mean for the Conservative Party. But anyway, the establishment's attempts at blocking Brexit have been defeated, and I think that that's a huge psychological win for millions of ordinary people. And I think actually that is the first stage of kind of healing process, because then you can believe, anyone can believe, whether you'll remain or leave or whatever, that if you want to change the world, that you matter, that it's possible, that you're not ignored, you can't be just kind of shut up and told to go away. But it did bring forward the issue of democracy in a very real way, I think, and it made me realise how fragile it was at home. And I think Seb referred to that, but one of the things that I've tried to argue throughout, I mean, I've been arguing this for 4 years, not anyone's listened, but I've never seen the European Union as a foreign imposition. You know, I didn't ever think that Brussels were coming over here telling us how to live our lives. That's a kind of caricatured Eurosceptic view. Actually, most of the laws that have brought into this country from Brussels were designed by British politicians. It's just that the British politicians found it easier to persuade their peers over in Brussels than they did to persuade us at home. I mean, you know, that pesky problem of accountability is it's much easier to get the technocrats that you agree with over there. And of course, what that's meant is that the EU's actually been scapegoated for many decisions. So one of the great things moving forward is politicians will never be able to blame the EU anymore. I mean, they'll blame them till the end of 2020, I know that, but I'm just saying. And then after that, every single decision that happens, they'll have to look us in the eye and say, yes, this is what we're doing, and we can go, great, or rubbish, and you're sacked, right? And that's one of the big gains for me. So one of the things that I think that bringing democracy back home means, and one of the things I noticed with the Brexit Party's slogan, change politics for good, was how much resonance that had, regardless of whether you were Labour or Tory or nothing or whatever. Change politics for good, people really are worried about the two-party system being kind of stuck, feel that first past the post no longer allows new movements to emerge in terms of Parliament, and therefore Parliament not to represent us, feels that there's all sorts of problems. I mean, obviously I hasten to add the House of Lords as an anti-democratic body, but also things like NGOs, all sorts of institutions where decisions seem to be made but where no one's accountable. And I think the fact that actually they didn't allow Brexit to happen 3.5 years ago has allowed a more sophisticated and long-standing deep conversation for 3.5 years about those issues. And I've spent the whole time in the Northwest, I had a great discussion in a working men's club in Accrington, and this sounds like a caricature, but it was more sophisticated on the Constitution than anything that I had when I discussed the same subject with students at LSE. Going to Southport, going around the whole of the Northwest, people were buzzing the whole time, democratically furious, but then now liberated to discuss these things. And I think that's very positive. But we need not manipulated citizens' assemblies from on top, which is what the government's proposing, but genuine citizens' gatherings, town hall meetings, and really kind of to harness that. Have I got a couple of minutes more? Yeah, okay. All right. We're all worried about the toxic divisions, and I think that they have been incredibly destructive. But there's two things. There's a danger when you've gone through a period of toxic divisions that your solution is that we should all come to a consensus, hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And I think that would be a disastrous result, because actually I want more debate, more argument than ever before. I want us to have the sense of freedom that we can now use this moment to discuss what kind of society we want. We won't all agree, so we'll all be arguing. That's okay with me. I think there are huge differences of opinion, but one of the things that clamps down on that is issues around free speech. People are actually frightened to say what they believe, frightened that if they say the wrong thing, they will be kind of closed down. I mean, God Almighty, when Alistair Stewart, a kind of 40 years in broadcasting kind of person can get closed down for quoting Shakespeare, we're in difficulties. But I also think that we've done a lot of other things. Faiza's talked about racism. I think there is racism in society that needs to be called out, but not just called out for and exposed and fought against in every single way. But it's also the case there's a lot of lashing out and calling people racist. So I went on a celebration party in Trafalgar Square the other night, and I was told that I was a fascist enabler and hanging out with racists and so on and so forth. And just to quote this from Tom Peck from The Independent, which some of you will know, a political sketch writer, who described that party and that gathering as, quote, a knuckle-gathering carnival of the irredeemably stupid. And then the word thick trended all day, and John Hannah, the actor, said, these were peasants and pensioners, and with other idiots and racists, I hope you all choke on your crap, cheap shit meat. Now, I know. The reason I'm saying that is because the othering that's going on also has had a huge problem of anti-working class snobbery, a real absolute rejection of ordinary people's right to exist and described as knuckle draggers. So what I want to do is to get over that by not trying to delegitimise those we disagree with by othering them and using language like that broadly.
Thank you. Right, so we obviously don't have a huge amount of consensus on the panel, but I'm not too worried by that because I think there's some questions that we should tease out. If I come back to you first, Seb, obviously what's been challenged here by your fellow panellists is this idea that we can get back to, the phrase you used, business as usual, feels like a step, well, it's a step backwards. Do you really think that that Brexit has changed the face of domestic policy, let's say, so little that it can revert to type, as it were?
Well, I think on a very basic level, what Brexit has done has reconfigured the political parties and who votes for them. That the Conservative Party is now the Brexit Party. Sorry, Claire, but when you look at the 2019 election, it was Brexit voters who voted Conservative. Whereas if you look at that in the 2017 election or people who wanted to leave the EU in 2015 election, it was a much smaller thing. So that has definitely changed. And the Labour Party is now trying to fish in the pool of Remain voters. And its biggest problem in the election was that the Remain vote was split between the Liberal Democrats and Labour. If Labour had got all of the Remain vote, it would have done a hell of a lot better and might have come close to forming a government there. What I mean about going back to normal is just talking about domestic politics, because for 3 years, absolutely nothing has happened. No major legislation has passed Parliament. The government hasn't done anything about social care, hasn't done anything about productivity, hasn't done anything about infrastructure. It hasn't built Heathrow. It hasn't built HS2. You know, it goes on, because the fact is all we've been doing is having this endless debate. And where I would differ with Claire is there's been some very good debates about democracy and free speech, but I'd say it's got to the point where it was detrimental for our society, because we were just totally constipated as a country. We just couldn't do anything because until we got this issue resolved. And on this issue, if you don't mind, of getting Brexit done, which both of you have disagreed with, I would say you're right. In some ways, Brexit does never end. It's just a deadline followed by more talks, followed by more disagreement, followed by another deadline, followed by more talks, followed by more disagreement. But we have left the EU. We are not going back in the EU. It might not be done now, but you know, who's talking about rejoining? Who's the rejoining force in the EU? We don't have commissioners. We don't have MEPs. Our flag isn't there. We no longer have a say in the decision-making process, for better or for worse. So it depends on what you find as getting Brexit done. But the fact is we are not members of the EU, full members, and we're not going to be. So I think on a fundamental level, it has changed something.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, and Faiza, anything you want to pick up on there? But also, the thing I was thinking about when you were talking is, obviously you've had a great amount of experience of talking to voters in your constituency. Post the general election, you've painted a rather bleak picture. Is there any hope that you can see for what, you know, how do you inspire voters from your perspective in this way if you've just, you know, very comprehensively laid out a huge amount of problems and a rather bleak bulletin?
What you were saying about, like, in business as usual. Business as usual was the financial crisis. It was like the Iraq War. It was black young people getting disproportionately stopped and searched. It was, you know, public spending, huge public spending cuts that were in itself, austerity in itself was an economic lie where you should have been investing, not taking money out. You know, it was ideological in its whole purpose. So, you know, the idea of like, well, now we can go back to business as usual. Business as usual was good for who? You know, there was a lot of people in this country that were very angry, and rightly so. And yeah, some of them voted Brexit as a way to demonstrate that anger and that feeling of a lack of power and 40 years of their communities not not just being left behind, but essentially actively held back. So, you know, when I talk, you know, I hate the idea now that somehow to be like proud of Britain, you have to be really excited about Brexit and really just like, really like blindly positive about everything. There are underlying issues in this world that we have to be honest about. And that's not to say there aren't ways to solve them. There are ways to solve them. We can do a lot better. We can make the public investments needed in green infrastructure. You know, we can invest back into the education system. We can, you know, stop the privatisation of NHS. We can make those decisions. Those decisions were always decisions we could make. And now there certainly won't be anyone else to blame. I mean, one thing that was really interesting, and yeah, obviously I'm a little bit bleak because, you know, I just lost an election. You know, we were one of the very few constituencies that had a swing towards Labour. So we had a almost 2% swing to Labour in the constituency. And yeah, I spoke to thousands of people. And what was interesting, where you know, people were telling me they were voting Labour for the first time. And one of the things was that you can engage with people, and if you don't just make assumptions about them and go in with, you know, derogatory ways and looking down on people and have a conversation and connect with them, then you know, you can persuade people and you can have discussions with people. There's no one I spoke to in Chingford and Woodford Green, you know, is a very mixed constituency. It was 50% leave, 50% remain. It's a high number of non-graduates compared to other London constituencies. There's no one I spoke to that was dumb or thick, and I spoke to thousands of people, you know, and so yeah, you know, I think that it is frustrating the way in which some of the toxicity has declined to that. But that's also not to deny that there are people that have said some horrific things over the last few years, and it is worse to be called a racist in this country than to actually be a racist.
Could I just quickly come back in on something very quickly? One thing that, like, obviously, you're completely right, there are some really big issues that need tackling in this country. If we just look back to the election, you know, Jeremy Corbyn talked about this being a country of homeless people and billionaires. Without any recognition, there are millions of people in between there. And one thing you know, your reading of the way the country is painted, you've named all the bad things as well. You also haven't mentioned the fact that, you know, life expectancy in this country is better than it's ever been, that people are wealthier than they've ever been in this country.
Falling.
It's not over the period we're talking about. You're talking about a 40-year period. It's a lot better than it was 40 years ago.
I mean, okay.
Right, exactly. But the point I just wanted to make was, in that election, Mr Corbyn and Labour painted this as this sort of dystopian, Dickensian vision of England, which is all very depressing, everything's awful, and the whole thing needs to be scrapped and torn up. The Conservatives said things are good, but they could be even better. And this really sort of negative reading of where things are in country, it's really, I feel that's a real problem.
I would agree with you in that you have to set out a positive vision for the country. And, you know, but let's not get away with a lot of what was happening with Labour was fixated either on, this wasn't true of Chingford and Woodford Green, but sort of nationally, either Brexit position and the way in which Jeremy Corbyn had been portrayed and his perceived leadership qualities. It wasn't really about policy, and I can tell you that because I knocked on a lot of doors and spoke to a lot of people. It wasn't that they disagreed that there weren't problems to sort out. They did agree there was problems to sort out, but they were essentially they didn't really trust the Labour Party to sort that out.
Okay, let me just bring in Claire here and pick up on anything you like, but one of the things that Faiza raised sort of inherently in what she was saying is this weird situation in which you have historic Labour voters for many, many years voting for Boris Johnson and his party, the Tory party, breaking with kind of tribal loyalties. But also the kind of hanging question in the air is the Conservative Party really going to manifest the kind of radical change that you want to see or that any of us want to see? Isn't this a kind of a strange political situation we find ourselves in when we're relying on the establishment party for a massive amount of democratic and otherwise change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a historically unique moment because the Tory party have tried to suggest that we're all Tories now, whereas I think millions of people voted for the Tory party as a vehicle to get what they wanted. Some of them are Tories and some of them aren't. But that means that you've got a Tory party that, first of all, has sections of society that it represents in places that it's never been to, with MPs that they don't even know who they are and they're in their own party. I mean, such was the shock that they got, that all these Tories, it's like sort of who represents us in Durham East to get, or whatever it is. He's like, oh, we never thought we stood a chance there. We'll go and find out who it is. I mean, it's like that sort of thing. So it's a very odd situation for them, right? And those voters have not all overnight become Conservative, but have, as I say, used them. So that's weird. But I actually think the Conservatives are sounding as though they are sensitive to that, and they've understood that. And one thing that you can say is that they're going to be held to account by those voters in a way that's different than if it was their traditional voters. And this isn't like Thatcherism. A lot of working class people were won over to a vision of conservatism that presented itself as Thatcherism at a time. It might sound odd, but that's what happened. They weren't won over to a version of Boris Johnsonism. They wanted to leave the European Union because they'd said that 3.5 years ago and they were fed up and no one let them do it. And Boris said he'd do it, so they used him. Different scenario. How weird's that? Then you've got a Labour Party who basically seems to have lost its instincts as a working class party. It doesn't represent Labour. That's the reality. And the reason why people didn't trust Corbyn was as much as anything because they thought he was a Leave person who in 2017 had basically said he'd see it through and then didn't have the bottle to say it out loud when it came to the last election. Now, how can you trust, whatever any of the other aspects of Corbyn that went wrong, and we all know that there's something fundamentally peculiar about today's contemporary Labour Party, regardless of some very fine parliamentarians in it, some very earnest people in it. It feels like a social work party whose interest in the working classes as poor people who need to be looked after. And I think that's one of the things that's a mistake about the way many people, and actually I think, Faiza, you were describing the people voted Brexit because they were from left behind areas and they're fed up with the financial crisis. I think you're missing the point. I don't think it's an economic question. That's what everybody thinks is all the time. They actually felt as though they were being done to by people who didn't take them seriously in a condescending, patronising way. And the thing about the referendum was just simply that somebody said, actually cynically in order to get us to vote, this vote means more, it's the most important vote you'll ever have in your lifetime. We're trusting you with a constitutional decision. We're outsourcing the most important constitutional decision this country's ever had to make for 100 years to you. And people went, bloody hell. That's impressive. Let's take ourselves. For once, you were being taken seriously. They went out, they researched, they didn't read the side of a bus, they didn't read the Sun. It wasn't like this idea that all that anyone did was a Russian bot email them and they went, I will vote Brexit. I've seen a bus, it's all NHS, all this. Or I'm so poor and downtrodden, I just want to have a bit of an anti-establishment rebellion. They actually decided to vote against the European Union's attack on sovereignty, and they recognise the slogan, take back control. They do all that, and what does everybody say to them? They win. Even better, your vote makes a difference. You vote a particular way. And the day after, everyone turns around, by the way, led by many Labour Party activists, and said, you stupid, stupid people, you've been brainwashed. You got it wrong, and what's more is you're backward and racist and you hate foreigners, and we're going to ignore what you said. I mean, imagine what that would feel like. It would make you bloody furious enough to abandon the Labour Party and vote for the Tories in the last election.
Faiza, I don't expect you to be toe the Labour Party line, as it were, and unless you want to. I don't mean you need to be a mouthpiece for Labour, but this charge that Claire has raised, in that even now going forward, it seems unclear whether the Labour Party has decided to, and it's the candidates in the leadership election have decided to embrace Brexit, or whether maybe, as you said, you actually can't bring yourself to cheer it along. I mean, how do you square that?
I think the thing is that I think there's a difference between having a plan, an aspirational plan, and I think it's true about kind of paternalism and the way that politics has for a long time operated in this kind of very top-down way, in which we haven't, people haven't listened enough to people, and where we don't have ways in which MPs, especially in safe seats, are checking in with voters continuously, that don't just have this election every 4 or 5 years. I mean, I think that's true, but I don't think the Tories operate any differently. I don't think that Brexit will mean that people feel like they have more control in their lives by itself. Now, there's other domestic policies you can do to try and address that. Sorry, what were you saying about Labour? Oh, well, I mean,
Well, this
need to have
this
a plan,
argument
I mean,
about
that's the
the
point. I mean,
patronising tone is, I think, the main point that Claire was raising. That
I mean, I think the Lib Dems were the ultimate patronising tone in that respect. You know, they wanted to just cancel the whole thing. But I think that the tone does need to change because things have changed. And that argument has been won. And so I think it's good that the candidates are coming out and saying that, well, look, now we need to have a plan about how we do what we do have to do, which is to protect jobs, protect people's livelihoods, to make sure that at the end of this, because you can do Brexit in like many different ways, that we don't have a country that's more unequal, where there's people in more lower income jobs, and that's absolutely what you'd expect the Labour Party to stand for.
And Seb, just moving on slightly, I expect that we're going to be circling around Brexit all night, and I think that's
Brexit so many times considering.
I'm happy with that because I think it's a very interesting topic. But to move it on to a slightly broader aspect, we've been talking a bit about how we come together or to leave the bitterness behind, as some people talk about in the media. Claire raised the issue of free speech and the more broader subject of public debate. Obviously, you've got a particular perspective from working within the centre of the media. Do you think that there is a problem with the way we're discussing politics today?
Oh, totally. Well, I think, look, the problem is there's been a big lack of trust in the other side's debate, I think, on all this, on whether it's Labour versus Conservative or Leave versus Remain. And other sides have basically said, I don't trust where you're coming from either. On the Remain side, it's been too many Leavers, you're all racists, and that you don't deserve to have a platform. I'd say, there's probably some Conservatives who don't acknowledge Labour, wants to genuinely fix inequality in this country, but there's also people in Labour who think all Tories are evil and want to kill their firstborn kittens and that sort of thing. So I think when you look at what's happened in Westminster and on TV and in newspaper articles over the past couple of years, that's why I am quite hopeful about this slightly cathartic moment we've had here, because if you remember, just as we came to the beginning of 2020, the head of the Remain and the Leave campaign both wrote a newspaper article and they said, okay, let's leave this behind us, we're leaving. That's now settled now, and as Claire said, we've had all those elections where the British people have made it abundantly clear what they want there, and I think the fact that's been respected will go some way to how people perceive their opponents. In terms of this kind of general thing about free speech and what you can and can't say about this, I think, the university situation is very, very interesting about this. One of the first things I did many, many years ago when I was at university was when we invited a certain speaker to speak at Durham University, and it was threatened that the activists were going to bus in and stop this person from speaking, and we had a campaign in favour of free speech. I think university should be somewhere that totally should have a place of free speech, and there's been so many examples of the NUS and various societies trying to clamp down on this, and I think it's very good that there has been some way this backlash, because the only way you get to the bottom of these very difficult issues is by having our people to speak on this. So it's something that's going to be backwards and forwards the whole time, because Twitter, Facebook have given people platforms that never existed before, and you can have a much bigger reach for anything you might say that you would get in a newspaper column. I don't know if there's going to be a resolution to the free speech issue in any, because I think it is a constant, as it should be in all functioning societies. There should be a push and pull on this.
Claire, on that issue, I mean, you've painted a picture of it being quite difficult for people to say what they feel, and there's been a contradiction between you and Faiza. You're saying that actually people feel less able to come out with the views that they have, and Faiza's saying actually she's hearing more and more people mouth off about different types of issues. And so then the question I want to put to you is how emboldened do people feel in this new political landscape, or how kind of shut away do they feel in silence? Because if you go on Twitter or talk about any issue, from an ageing population to building more playgrounds in the local park, it feels like people are rowing. It feels like people are coming out with loads of conflicting viewpoints and are not afraid of it. But do you think that actually that's not a true picture, that there is a problem with people feeling like they have to hide their views from the public?
So, first of all, on the issue of racism, there's undoubtedly the case, as Faiza says, that some people are now emboldened to be openly racist. I agree that that's what's happened. I actually think that's happened relatively recently, and I also think that it's not as bad as it was 10, 15 years ago, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't it hasn't got worse from when it was silenced. So I'm not saying that's not true. But it's also the case that I don't think it's very helpful that people racialise discussions so often. And I do think you get into a position where people, because they use the term, call people racist so regularly, and I mean, you know, and white supremacist and fascist enablers and so on, that then that kind of cheapens and demeans the actual seriousness of racism when it occurs. And I was also simply pointing out that there's been a lot of othering and bigotry that's more general than that, because you do get into a scenario. That's why I was giving the quote about the knuckle draggers. I mean, racial thinking is where you see somebody as less than human, like an animal, right? And there's been a lot of that, and it's not simply been directed to people because of their skin colour, or in some instances it's the gammons because of their particular skin colour. And I suppose I would like some consistency in the way that we deal with when people are bigoted. I don't think they should be banned, by the way. I'm just saying that there are some people who will say, oh, I only see bigotry this side, and you only see bigotry that side. And I do not think that the majority of people who voted Leave are racist. I think that 1-2% were, and they are, you know, won't shut up, right? And that's fine. But there's also the case that a lot of the people that I know who become slightly enthusiastic about their Remain identity, let's put it that way, spend the whole time, like there's one person in particular who I know who lives in the home counties and sells yachts. And he's only started to notice racism recently. And he basically, you know, he'd never noticed racism in his life. So it's all Leavers, right? The thing is that I've been fighting racism all my political life, so I've happened to notice it. He keeps pointing out pictures of fascists with swastikas that he's seen, and he'd never seen them before. I've been beaten up by them, and I've done a fair enough beating up of them myself over the years, right? So it's no surprise to me there are far-right fascists in this country. I just don't think there's very many of them, right? And when you have them, you take them up. And when there's racism in meetings that I've done, I've argued back. Well, you know, that's all I'm saying, right? And most people in the room have said that's racist and argued back as well. Whereas actually, most people would look at the kind of meetings that I've been doing in the Northwest, and the kind of prejudice that they have is say, you're all racist in the room because you're there. And that's where I'm objecting. One other thing I just wanted to say, just because it's if I could just say this one thing. I'm not suggesting that society is going to be sunlit, you know, uplands from now on that we've got Brexit. What I'm suggesting is that we're more honest. We've been arguing in bad faith. That's what I'm saying is you delegitimise your opponents by calling them either racist or scum or knuckle draggers, or by calling them all the racist epithets in the world, which is also vile and disgusting bile. And what I'm suggesting is that we all stop doing that, not by banning them, but because we grow up and we take on arguments, not trying to have a cheap win by trying to shut somebody up by labelling them. That's all.
Of course we want to. I mean, look, let's be honest about it. How have the Conservatives won? And these divisive narratives, and I've been working on class issues for a long time. We never heard white working class. We were all working class growing up. You know, I was the daughter of a car mechanic. I grew up with loads of, you know, white working. It wasn't like, oh, you're divided, and you know, it's and so the extent to which divisions have been purposely riled up, metropolitan elite versus, you know, northerners, or if you're Sajid Javid, but going to the north. I mean, it's like it's absolute mythology. They have been able to divide people, and this is what we found in our research. When we interviewed working class people of all races, what do they talk about? They talk about 4 things. They talk about precariousness. They talk about life on the edge, whether it be money, whether it be housing, whether it be immigration status. They talk about power and a lack of power and voice in their lives. They talk about prejudice, feeling looked down upon. And they talk about place and pride in their place, and sometimes in places like London, in the cities, being pushed out. They all talk about that, regardless of race. And what was interesting when we did that research and we asked people at the end of the interview, do you consider yourself working class? Black and brown people kept saying, oh no, but I think I have to be white, don't I, to be working class? Or do I have to go to the pub to be working class? This is the extent to which these divisive narratives have been put through, whether you see it in the Daily Mail, whether you see it in the way in which we do certain TV shows. You know, there have been ways in which we have riled people up and pitted them against each other. And that is just, you can see that, you can feel that in different parts of the country. And the idea that as if everyone in London is a metropolitan elite and there aren't working class people here, or that there aren't Labour voters and ethnic minorities in places like Bradford, like as if in the north is all white working class. It's just not true. You know, this is all a caricature. And so we can't just stop doing it, because in a way it's been used as a tool to win. Like, I'd love us to stop doing it, but it's, and you know, Dominic Cummings was going out and doing focus groups in the north to see if he could talk about what Labour's policy was on trans issues, if that would wind up people. They're purposely using this as an agency to win. So let's not be naive about this. This is what is happening.
Yeah, but so
why are you playing the game?
Yeah, if I could just come in on that.
What game am I playing by talking about racism? I'm playing a game.
Let Seb come in.
Just on this point about divisive narratives. Like for decades, the left has wound up narratives as well. Like Labour's whole thing was about the rigged elite and trying to pitch this idea of the top and the bottom of society. So just both sides do this. It's not just a right thing trying to split people. That's what political parties do.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it is true that the
Yeah, but
very
you're
rich in
still
the
dividing
country
people.
like, you know, ultimately when you think about if you want to redistribute wealth more, which is what we need to do given the levels of inequality in this country, historically high, you know, you have to talk about the way in which power and money and wealth is being captured at the top of society. And that's just a fact. That isn't an agency by which you just pit people that have very similar lives against each other.
But this... Sorry.
Yes,
You
Claire.
go.
And I just want to say, can
I'm
we say about
interrupting,
free
go on,
speech?
you.
It's really frustrating. I mean, free speech, of course, you know, let's have an argument about free markets, you know, versus social, or whatever. But why is racism up for debate?
Claire, do you want to respond to some of that?
Because a lot of what's described as racism is not racist. It's used actually in the way that you've just described cynically about Dominic Cummings. It's used to shut people up. And you do and must know that. And identity politics has been a great scourge on the Labour Party. I think it's actually weakened the Labour Party because it's actually got itself into a situation whereby the very thing which you described positively as the way that most people related to each other despite skin colour, as you pointed out about you were just brought up as working class, you didn't think about it in that way. Now nobody does that because they're encouraged to see themselves through the prism of ethnicity and to actually...
You can do both,
sadly,
though.
Look, I'm saying, you said racism isn't up for debate. I'm saying racism is now charged against such a wide variety of people, and if you try and challenge it, you're accused of being an apologist for it. Mm-hmm. And actually moving away from racism to maybe make the point about how it gets complicated. You know, actually the assumption was that when I was talking about the northern working class, or at least the northwest, that I was in meetings, that they were all white. Well, actually, I didn't think they were. The point is that the people who were caricaturing the Brexit Party supporters did. But interestingly, when we've actually had debates on things like the NHS and social care, which actually we did have lots of discussions on those kind of things, and this is not just my experience of being in the Brexit Party, but anyway, we do have these discussions. There was massive rows, great creative rows, about whether there should be changes on the NHS, how we might change it, and all the rest of it. And somebody stood up and said, as a trade union shop steward, this is really liberating, because if I raise this in my Labour Party branch, I'd be accused of being a Tory and told that I now wanted people to die on trolleys. And that is the problem. We're not actually having an open, free discussion about the future of the health service or social. Forget the race question. We all know that if you say the wrong thing and you get done over as being a Tory apologist in certain circles, that's you done. And I'm saying that I think that that is unhealthy. And I'm not an apologist, well, not even an apologist. I do not, guess what, like the Tories, right? I am not a Tory. But as the most irritating thing in the world is simply going, I hate the Tories in order to get big claps. I just think it's inappropriate to keep going, it's the Tories' fault. We all know what the Tories are like, but they've got a massive majority, and I do think that opposition parties might have to explain why that happened if they're going to recover instead of keep going, it's the Tories, they're evil, they hate us, blah, blah, blah. We all know that. get over it, right? Now build something positive.
Right, we're about to break for a minute, we've opened up a massive can of worms, and I don't want to put the lid back on because we're going to come back and have a broader discussion about this. But just a final question from you guys, just a minute each, is I'm going to pose a really, what to me feels like a lame question, but actually it is interesting, which is, can you build consensus, or should you even want to build consensus? Is, as Claire said, the process of actually opening up more arguments and more debate a positive thing, or should we be thinking about the, going back to business as usual, or the kind of healing that needs to happen with the sort of almost picture of a broken Britain that Faiza has painted? Is consensus building a good thing going forward, Seb?
Yes, someone who kind of would put themselves as sort of the one nation sort of centre-righty spectrum of things, that I believe that there are policies and there are things you can do in the way that you govern. You look to change society that do actively seek to bring people together, because when Disraeli originally defined the concept of one nation, it was about this idea you've got two different societies that don't interact and don't understand each other. We clearly have that. That was exposed in the Brexit vote, and that something needs to be done about that. And I think we have got a government that looks as if that's the route it's going down there. I don't think it's a good thing. It's a good thing to have debates, but I think it should be with a purpose. And I think one of the things we talked about, this point about challenging people's views here, it's to what end? Is there good faith in what you're trying to do? Are you trying to, look at what someone is saying just to take personal chips out of them, or to destroy their personality or destroy their career, or actually trying to improve the debate generally? I hope when I talk about business as usual, that's what we're going back to, that we're doing politics and policy with good faith to get the right outcomes, not just to win against the other side.
Okay, thanks. Faiza, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's ways, in the way in which we've sort of handled discussions locally. When you talk about things like the NHS and what you want from schools and education, it's a whole different type of conversation. And absolutely, those things are absolutely up for debate and conversation, and people's lives and the experiences that they're having, and being able to bring those life experiences to the table and have that discussion. So there are ways in which you facilitate discussions where, you are able to find consensus or have those discussions, and it's often about the things that people care most about. At least in Chingford, Woodford Green, like Brexit barely came up on the doorstep, and it was mainly like, it's taking me ages to get a GP appointment, or I'm worried about crime, or so. I think there's ways in which you can have these conversations that don't have to be as toxic. And certainly we have to build some consensus around this. And in a way, the consensus was there, and the consensus is more on the left, which is why, the Tories don't go on about austerity in the same way. And they are talking about investment because actually there has been consensus on some of those left policies, and certainly on public services, that people don't want them cut more. But I think that also we've got, the opposite of having more debate is closing. And of course, we don't want to close debate. There's arguments to be won. There's arguments to be won on immigration, for instance, and the left has been very bad. The left has been very bad on this. They've just made it an economic argument. Let's talk about love. Let's talk about the fact that you should be able to fall in love with someone and not have to earn like 28 grand a year to be able for them to be able to come and live here. Let's talk about refugee children being able to be reunited with their families. There are arguments that we still need to win. So absolutely, there's areas where there's some consensus emerging, but there's arguments also to be won, and we should never be scared to have those discussions.
Okay, thank you. And Claire?
So I think we should listen to each other more, because I do think that we just listen to the caricature and not listen to what people are saying. I think we've also got to stop caricaturing each other. I'm sure I do it all the time, and I know that one bends a stick to tell a story and so on, but I actually think that we should stop trying to do that. And I think we've probably got to move away from being sectarian about party politics. And what I was trying to indicate was that actually I actually think the two main political parties don't represent what they used to represent anyway, so there's almost no point being sectarian about them, because they've actually abandoned their roots one way or another for good or bad. But I think that sectarianism of just lashing out because it's a different party just drives me bloody mad. I mean, it's as bad as when somebody says black and you say white. I mean, what's the point of that? So, I think about tackling the hard issues like, the fact that kids are knifing each other or terrorism and what you do about it, on the street, and all of these things. Like, sometimes you do have to say some of our lashing out is not going to have any impact. But I don't think we should have false consensus for the sake of peace, because that often will mean anodyne. And often people who say we want consensus means shut up and don't say anything provocative. And let's be honest, that's not going to appeal to me. I mean, I think you should be able to say what you think. I also think you should be able to think out loud, which can mean that you can misspeak and experiment with ideas, but say the wrong thing, saying, why don't we do this, without somebody leaping on you from a great height. So I'd be more generous with each other. I mean, we're fellow citizens. We've got challenges ahead. Why don't we think the other side are evil? I don't.
Can we please thank all of our speakers for this first half? And I'm going to hand you back to Ria for this little break.
Hi. Are we on? We may be on. Hello, hello, hello. Sorry, I'm using a microphone because I had a cold lately. Thank you all so much for sitting so beautifully through that. We're going to have a 15-minute break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to hear what you have to think. So please do start your conversation in the break. Speak to as many people as you can. Please feel free to come to me if you definitely have a comment that you want to say, and I'll make sure that you get to say that in the second half. We do have more of the champagne, wine, beer in the kitchen, and nibbles to get those brains flowing. And then we'll be back in the room in, let's say, 15, at most 20. Toilets are all the way down in the basement if you need them. There's one upstairs and smoking outside. And we'll see you back in 15, 20 minutes. Thank you one more time to the panel and Ella for hosting.
What were you guys laughing about?
Well, I think I'm hoping there'll be questions. Well, speaks to say I thought it was a good speech by Boris.